Yeah, music now.
Hey, welcome back, folks, to another episode of the American Genesis, the Creation of America Scripture, where we're looking at the origin of our government, specifically through the lens of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. We are finishing the summer of '87, where the delegates got together and actually wrote the Constitution. So, with that being said, let's kind of get a little music to get us started for the day.
If tomorrow all the things were lost I'd worked for all my life, and I had to start again with just my children and my wife, I'd thank my lucky stars to be living here today, 'cause the flag still stands for freedom and they can't take that away. And I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the men who died and gave that right to me. And I'd gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today. 'Cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA.
Okay, well, last week, remember we talked about the ratification of the Constitution. We talked about this division between what was called the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. We had all these essays going on between, the two groups. One of them in support of ratification of the Constitution. The other group, the Anti-Federalists, who were opposed to it. And finally, it took almost 2 years for all 13 states to finally ratify the Constitution. And really, even after 9 of them had ratified it, which was all it took, remember, Virginia and New York had not ratified it, which, for all practical purposes, without their votes, it would have been a meaningless Constitution. But they finally did ratify it, primarily because James Madison finally agreed that he would author a specific set of Bill of Rights as soon as the Constitution was ratified. And he did that. And that's what we will be talking about after we talk about what's exactly in the Constitution here for a few weeks. So, what are we going to talk about today? Well, let's kind of sit back and look at what has been written and look at the principles that are found in the Constitution. Now, they may not be exactly spelled out. In fact, the case, none of these are specifically mentioned in the Constitution, but they are very much kind of the core, the enduring principles that are embedded within the Constitution that we need to know about. And these principles have allowed the Constitution to provide a government which has virtually remained unchanged over 237 years, except for the 17 amendments that were adopted after the initial ratification in the Bill of Rights. Again, folks, I have to tell you, that is, every time I say that, it just makes me stop and just think, how in the world were these people so gifted that they could write this very short document that still governs such a complex nation that is so much radically different than what it was 237 years ago? And my only explanation, and some out there may disagree with me, but I think it was definitely divinely inspired. I mean, I just think it had to be, because I don't know of any other way that they could have done this without some intervention from, from another power. The principles have also allowed for the Constitution to adapt to a nation which was initially a small agricultural nation to the most complex and diverse nation in the world. And again, this is the genius of the Constitution that was able to do this. So, what are these enduring principles? And we're going to look at each one specifically. Well, one of them was rule of law. The second one was the concept of republicanism, and I'm not talking about political party here. I'm talking about the concept of republicanism, which we'll talk about. The separation of the powers, the checks and balance system, and national supremacy. Again, you don't see any of this specifically mentioned. The rule of law is there. Republicanism is there. It is actually mentioned, I think, two times toward the end of the Constitution. The separation of powers is not specifically mentioned, nor is checks and balances, and even national supremacy. But that's the core principles of the Constitution. So let's look at each one. First of all, the rule of law. Again, it's not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, but the belief universally exists that it's one of the principles of the document. It provides that all people are created equal under the law. Now, remember, when the Constitution was written, it was a pretty liberal document, but it did not include women. It did not include minorities or slaves. It did not include non-property owners, but eventually those were franchised. What it means is that the ruler as well as the ruled must follow the law. Nobody is above the law in this country, at least in principle. In principle, no person, is above the law. Now, how can we demonstrate that? Well, in modern times, within my lifetime at least, I have seen one president resign, and I have seen two presidents be impeached. You can agree or disagree all day long about whether any of that should have occurred, but it did occur because, at least in principle, a group of people felt like that these people had broken the law and that they needed to suffer the consequences. Nixon, of course, was not impeached. He would have been. Nixon would have been impeached, and he would probably have been removed from office for some of the situations in the Watergate thing. Clinton and Trump both faced impeachment hearings. Trump faced two. Neither one were found guilty, and thus they did not suffer the consequence of having to leave office. I thought for our purposes, we would go back. I'm sure every one of you out there remember when President Nixon resigned. So let's look at his resignation speech he gave from the White House, the Oval Office. I still remember this just as clear as the day it happened. I was home watching TV when it occurred.
Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shape the history of this nation. Each time I have done so to discuss with you some matter that I believe affected the national interest. In all the decisions I have made in my public life, I have always tried to do what was best for the nation. Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere, to make every possible effort to complete the term of office to which you elected me. In the past few days, however, it has become evident to me that I no longer have a strong enough political base in the Congress to justify continuing that effort. As long as there was such a base, I felt strongly that it was necessary to see the constitutional process through to its conclusion, that to do otherwise would be unfaithful to the spirit of that deliberately difficult process and a dangerously destabilizing precedent for the future. But with the disappearance of that base, I now believe that the constitutional purpose has been served, and there is no longer a need for the process to be prolonged. I would have preferred to carry through to the finish, whatever the personal agony it would have involved. And my family unanimously urged me to do so. But the interests of the nation must always come before any personal considerations. From the discussions I have had with congressional and other leaders, I have concluded that because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress that I would consider necessary to back the very difficult decisions and carry out the duties of this office in the way the interests of the nation will require. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad. To continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issues of peace abroad and prosperity without inflation at home. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Okay, so there's an example of the rule of law, how a president of the United States, the most powerful person in this country, has to follow the rule of law or else face the consequences. Now, the second enduring principle is republicanism. Now, remember what republicanism is. Republicanism is the concept where we have an indirect democracy. And that is because the majority of the delegates did not trust the common man. They rejected a direct democracy. And the reason they did that was because they felt like, there would be mob rule if they allowed everyone to vote directly for issues. That's why we have a representative democracy. It's because they wanted to avoid this mob rule. Now, you might think, well, that would never happen. Folks, it did happen. In fact, it happened very early on in our country's history. In 1794, there was something called the Whiskey Rebellion took place, where farmers in Western Pennsylvania refused to pay a national tax. And they, this tax had been levied upon them, and they felt like it was an unfair tax. And as a result, they decided not to pay tax. And when the government tried to force them to do it, they rebelled. And most people don't realize this, but President Washington actually went in the head of an army to go out and stop this rebellion in 1794, called the Whiskey Rebellion. So the framers, in their wisdom, compromised in Article 1, Section 4 by letting the state legislatures set the times and places and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives within the hands of the states. This was a compromise to those who wanted direct democracy. They said, okay, we won't give you direct democracy, but what we will do is let the states control the elections. Now, you might know, if you've been listening to the news the last few weeks, there is a lot of people who feel like that our national elections need to be nationalized. In other words, put within the hands of the national government. I can guarantee you there will be a great deal of a large number of people are going to resist this if that indeed tries to happen, because this goes against one of the core principles of the Constitution. That is, that we have an indirect representative democracy. So let's kind of look at this Whiskey Rebellion. It's one of those very little unknown pieces of history in America that had a great deal to do with the direction of this country's government.
Today on the Daily Dose, the Whiskey Rebellion. During the Revolutionary War, individual states incurred heavy wartime debts, prompting Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton to push for a federal takeover of all war-related obligations. Despite President Washington's opposition to a tax on whiskey, Congress passed one anyway in 1791, which fell disproportionately on smaller whiskey producers who paid higher per-gallon tax rates than larger producers. As a result, excise officers sent to collect the tax were met with increasing defiance and growing threats of violence. On September 11th, excise officer Robert Johnson was riding through his collection route in western Pennsylvania when he was surrounded by 11 men dressed as women. The mob stripped him naked and then tarred and feathered him before stealing his horse and abandoning him in the forest. Incidents escalated over the next several years, and in 1793, the home of Pennsylvania excise officer Benjamin Wells was broken into twice by angry protesters. In the summer of 1794, Federal Marshal David Lennox began the process of serving writs to 60 distillers in western Pennsylvania who refused to pay their whiskey taxes. After a July 16th attack on wealthy landowner and tax collector John Neville's home, Neville grabbed a gun and shot at the crowd, striking and killing Oliver Miller. In retaliation, the following day, 700 men marched on Neville's home, and when a 10-man military detachment refused to back down to mob rule, Neville's home and outbuildings were burned to the ground. Less than a week later, 7,000 largely intoxicated whiskey rebels met up at Braddock's Field east of Pittsburgh, where officials quelled the insurrectionists with several gifted barrels of whiskey. After Washington's peace envoy to the region failed, under the auspices of the Militia Acts of 1792, Washington assumed emergency power to assemble more than 12,000 men from the surrounding states and eastern Pennsylvania, commissioning them into a federal militia. The large and well-armed militia marched into western Pennsylvania and was met by angry citizens, yet very little violence. When a countering rebel army failed to appear, the militia rounded up suspected rebels instead, despite the fact that the true rebel instigators had already fled the area. The men were marched to Philadelphia to stand trial, and while only 2 men were found guilty of any treasonous acts, Washington pardoned both men in an attempt to de-escalate tensions caused by the whiskey tax. The federal response to the Whiskey Rebellion was widely believed to be a critical test of federal authority, one that Washington's fledgling government met with success. The whiskey tax that inspired the rebellion remained in effect until 1802, until Republican President Thomas Jefferson repealed the tax for good, claiming that citizen protests and resistance to such a tax made it impossible to collect. And there you have it. Thou shalt not tread on American booze. Today on the Daily Dose. If you like learning something new Today on the Daily Dose.
Okay, so there's an example of how, Bob Rule, can threaten Republican form of government. And that's why, the framers wanted to install this type of representative democracy rather than a direct democracy, because they were concerned that this kind of thing would take place. I think we have become more sophisticated, and hopefully we would not have this kind of thing take place again. But, there's always a concern about that. Well, the third enduring principle is the separation of powers. Some people think this is the genius of the Constitution. The framers, remember, wanted to form a pluralistic government. A pluralistic government, again, is one of those where there's many centers of power, and they purposely put all the power out into different areas so no one group would dominate. They didn't want Congress to be the greatest of the three. They didn't want the president he didn't want him to be a king. They didn't want the courts to be totally in charge. So they separated the powers out into these three branches of government. So one branch would never be able to be totally in charge. And again, that came from John Locke, who had written about this in his two treatises on government, where he said, you have to separate the powers out in order to have an effective democracy. The result was that the powers given to one branch were counterbalanced by powers given to two other branches. That checks and balances, which is the fourth one that we're going to talk about, they're almost inseparable. You can't talk about one without the other. So I'm going to play a video about separation of powers, and it talks about checks and balances. And then when I get to checks and balances, it will talk about the separation of powers. So, they're kind of intermingled between the two. So let's look at this short video about the separation of powers.
This concept of separation of powers is what makes America great. It is absolutely the genius of our democracy.
Here we are over 2 centuries later, and still the Constitution with its 3 pillars of government exists in the same form as it did at the founding.
All of these parts working together creates a team effort, which really aids our form of government and creates its stability.
Many people don't realize that the Constitution sets out 3 branches of government. The first is the legislative branch. The second branch is the executive branch. Now, we typically think of the president, but it also includes all of his executive officers. And the third is the judicial branch, and that means the Supreme Court, but it also means the United States Courts of Appeals and the United States District Courts.
Why would the framers want to set up such a complicated system that consisted of 3 branches of government with separate powers but with some codependent powers?
They were students of human psychology.
Because they appreciated that a free society does require the fusion of authority.
They said the right way to do this is to have checks and balances.
Each branch has designated powers, but some of those powers are codependent on cooperation with the other branches of government.
The process of passing a bill in the Congress requires a lot of debate and discussion and compromise.
Congress, they can't act alone to create a law. It requires the president to approve the law. Of course, there's the veto power.
If he vetoes it, it goes back to the Congress, and if they truly believe that the law should be passed, they can override that veto by a 2/3 vote.
Those laws are further held in check by the judicial review process to make sure that the law complies with our Constitution.
If someone doesn't like that law, they can challenge it and argue that it violates the Constitution, and they can file a lawsuit in federal court. And if that happens, it's up to the judicial branch to decide whether the law complies with the Constitution or not.
The judiciary is likewise checked by the other branches. Number one, it has no policy role in the government. It simply interprets the law. And so if a particular judge or circuit judges or the Supreme Court justices disagree with public policy, they have no say in that. They simply interpret the laws that come before them.
And if Congress passes a law that's challenged under the Constitution, the judiciary has the power to say, that law violates the Constitution and to strike it down. But that's not the end of the story.
Congress can come back and look for another way to try and achieve the same result in a fashion that is constitutional, and they've done that on many occasions in our history. We've got Congress and the president, and they're elected.
The president nominates us, and then the Senate confirms us. But the reason for that is so that we can retain our independence.
The founders felt that the independence of the judiciary was critical, and one of the crucial ways we have that independence is through life tenure.
And we don't have to answer to Congress or to the White House or to the executive branch if we make a decision they disagree with.
When there's a decision from the Supreme Court that's not popular, sometimes that lack of popularity is exactly the way the system is supposed to be working. The example I'll give you there is flag desecration.
There was legislation that precluded the burning of a flag. Obviously, the executive branch sought to enforce that legislation, and then it ultimately became the responsibility of the courts to make an assessment as to whether that legislation was constitutional.
No one's in favor of burning a flag, but the idea is that the Supreme Court believes that the Constitution protects everyone's liberties, even for speech you don't like.
And that's what the First Amendment is about, and it's through the separation of powers that we're able to protect that.
The courts are the ultimate guardians of the law. We don't have the power of the purse. We don't have an army. Our only power is our ability to defend the Constitution.
What the federal judiciary has is, as the guardian of the Constitution, is we have the last word on what the Constitution means.
The reason we endure is because we have a system that ensures through these three separate branches of government that check and balance each other all the time, that all of us are protected by a single system that seeks to ensure fairness, liberty, and justice for everyone.
Okay, so that is the third enduring principle, separation of powers, where, the powers of our government are separated out into an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branch. Now, they talked about the checks and balance system. So let's kind of look at checks and balances, and then we'll watch a short video, which will talk also about separation of powers. Like I said, you can't talk about one without talking about the other. At the same time, the framers of the Constitution created the separation of powers. They created a system of checks and balances to further ensure that no one branch became dominant. They wanted to make sure that, yes, we separated these powers out, but we don't want one branch to become more powerful than the other. So the executive, the legislative, and judicial branches were all given powers to limit the power of the other two branches. The checks and balance system, while effective, sometimes contributes to gridlock. And this is really important because sometimes it appears to us that our Constitution doesn't work effectively because it seems to, the old saying about the gears of government grinding slow. Well, they do grind slow, but they grind exceedingly fine also. This was intentional. The framers intended for the Constitution to be, slow. They wanted it to be that way because they did not want anyone to adopt a law in the heat of passion. They said, we want you to think about this. We want to be able to really consider the consequences of what it is that you're about to do to make sure that, if you do this, that it will be the right thing to do. So again, we have this system of checks and balances where each branch can keep another branch from doing something. So let's look at a video about checks and balances.
Checks and balances. After breaking from a British government that lorded over the colonists, the framers of the Constitution wanted to make sure that their government did not get too powerful. In order to do this, they established three separate branches of government that would each have its own specific powers. The three branches of government are the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. The legislative branch, or Congress, is comprised of the House of Representatives and the Senate. This branch has the power to make laws, the power to tax and spend, the power to approve treaties, and the power to declare war. The executive branch consists of the President, the executive and cabinet departments, and the independent governing agencies, like the IRS. The President is the head of the executive branch. He has the power to carry out the laws passed by Congress, recommend new legislation, set foreign policies, and nominate Supreme Court justices. The judicial branch is comprised of the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, and the District Court. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the judicial branch. This branch has the power to interpret all laws and decide cases involving state rights. In order to ensure that no one branch becomes more powerful than the other, A system of checks and balances was incorporated into the Constitution. In other words, each branch of government would be able to check the powers of the other. Take, for example, the process of passing a law. A bill must be passed through both houses of Congress before it goes to the President for approval. The President can either sign the bill or veto the bill. Now, even if the bill is vetoed, Congress may overturn the veto with a 2/3 majority vote. The Supreme Court has the final say because it can decide if a law is constitutional or unconstitutional. In the framework of the Constitution, there are many powers issued to each branch of government. In order to keep these powers from growing too strong and allowing one branch to overpower the others, there are many other ways that one branch can check the power of another. Consider the following examples. The President has the power to order troops to fight, but only Congress can formally declare war. So, without Congress's support, the President cannot maintain a war, even though the President is the commander-in-chief of the military. The President makes judicial appointments, but these must be confirmed by the Senate before they can be made judges. The President can issue an executive order, but the judicial branch can find it unconstitutional and overturn the order. Supreme Court justices are appointed for life, but they can be impeached by Congress or removed from office. The court system can imprison a citizen. However, the President can pardon the individual and set the individual free. This system of checks and balances gives each branch of government a voice in the country's affairs. If one branch ever tries to overstep its boundaries, there is always a check in place for one of the other two branches to pull the one branch back into a balance of power.
So our system of checks and balances and separation of powers has worked pretty effectively. There have been times when one branch tried to usurp some of the power from another branch. There are many instances like this, and we will talk about some of them as we go through the Constitution a little bit more in depth here in the next few weeks. The final enduring principle is national supremacy. Now, remember, folks, this was the most hotly contested principle in the Constitution. It was so important for the founders to get this right. They wanted to make sure that the national government was the supreme government, but at the same time, they wanted to make sure that they were not a tyrannical national government, that they didn't trod upon the rights of the citizens or the states. And this was a very difficult thing to do. The framers, though, left absolutely no doubt who they thought, should be in charge, and that was the national government. Not everybody agreed with that. Remember, this was the whole concept behind the Federalist and Anti-Federalist ratification problem was the idea that who was going to be in charge as such. As a result, early on in our country, there was several attempts to nullify the national government. Now, what that means is this. Some states, and we're going to talk about one of the instances, the nullification crisis of 1832, which involved South Carolina. And South Carolina decided that they were not going to participate in a national tariff. And they nullified it within their state. They said, this law, we made the laws, we're part of the union, and we can nullify it. And if we do nullify it and the government tries to force us to participate, we can dissolve our union and go our own way. Of course, this is exactly what happened, folks, in 1861 with the Civil War. That was the nullification theory on steroids. But we're going to look at an earlier attempt in 1832 because this was probably the most serious attempt on the part of a state to nullify a national law and make it unconstitutional within the state boundaries of South Carolina. So nullification supporters argued the power to declare federal laws unconstitutional. is inherent in the concept of state sovereignty, but also is one of the powers reserved to the states in the 10th Amendment. There have been other instances since the Civil War where there have been instances of attempts to nullify. We're going to talk about one of them when we get to the Bill of Rights, particularly as it applies to the Second Amendment, which involved my home state of Missouri and the very recent idea about nullification. We'll talk about that later on. But here's a short film on the nullification crisis of 1832, where South Carolina attempted to nullify a national law.
In 1828, Congress passed a tariff to protect American manufacturers against cheaper foreign imports. This protective tariff almost brought the country to the brink of civil war.
The idea of a tariff is quite simple, really. It is a duty on a foreign good. Let's say the English blanket would cost $10. The Americans could only make it for $12. And so there's no way they could compete. Well, if you slap on a 50% tariff, suddenly that British blanket costs $15, the American blanket costs $12, and now you've helped out domestic manufacturing.
The tariff of 1828 appealed to manufacturers, and the heart of American manufacturing was in the North, in New England's growing textile industry. But Southerners hated the tariff. They called it the Tariff of Abominations.
Well, the South was not a manufacturer. The South exported goods and then had to import the manufactured goods. And so the South wanted low tariffs so that they could buy these goods more cheaply.
The vice president at the time was John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, and he championed the fight against the tariff.
And in 1828, as Vice President of the United States, but anonymously, John Calhoun writes what becomes known as the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. And he says a couple of key things. Number one, the tariff is unconstitutional. And the reason that the tariff is unconstitutional in Calhoun's eyes is that it helps the North at the expense of the South. And here is where Calhoun, as a political theorist, really reveals some of his brilliance. He figures out a way that a state can constitutionally and legally nullify, void a federal law.
When Congress agreed to lower the tariff in 1832, the South Carolina contingent that wanted it eliminated was unsatisfied. It passed an ordinance of nullification, which declared the federal tariff did not exist within state boundaries.
The trump card for Calhoun, and what makes his theory of nullification that much more radical, is that he says, if a state does in fact determine that a law is unconstitutional, and they nullify that law, if the federal government attempts to force that law upon the state has the right to secede, to leave the Union.
President Andrew Jackson was furious. He railed against nullification and quietly began to prepare the Army for war. Behind closed doors, he told friends he would invade South Carolina and hang its leaders if the state did not back down. In 1833, Jackson got Congress to pass the Force Bill, authorizing him to use troops to enforce federal tariff laws if necessary. That same day, Senator Henry Clay engineered a compromise to gradually reduce the tariff enough to placate South Carolina. The bill squeaked through Congress, preventing a civil war. The South Carolina legislature met and withdrew its nullification of the tariff, but in a final act of defiance, abolished Jackson's Force Bill in their state.
Nullification as a theory never rears its head again. No one ever attempts to nullify a federal law again. But it does not kill the idea of secession. Secession continues to roll around, and as we know, there's an attempt to secede from the Union in 1861 by a number of southern states.
Okay, so we've looked at the 5 enduring principles now. The concept of separation of powers, checks and balances, republicanism, national supremacy, and I've already forgot the first one. Oh, sorry about that. Senior moment here. Well, I want to end this by encouraging each one of you to go out tomorrow and vote if you haven't already done so. And I have a funny feeling that a vast majority of you out there listening to me today have already voted. If you have not, I encourage you to do this because, folks, that's what this is all about. This is what our government, it is consent of the governed. And we are those who give consent to be governed. And we decide who is going to be the leaders of this country. And so it's so important that we do this. Now, what are we going to do from this point on? We've talked about the Declaration of Independence and the historical roots of that. We've talked about the summer of '87, and we've talked about how this Constitution was written. The next 5 or 6 weeks or so, we're going to actually look at what's inside the Constitution. Now, this is not going to be an American government class. It's going to be, we're going to look at what's in there. But I'm going to try to really concentrate on the areas that maybe you've never really thought about. For instance, one of the first things we're going to talk about is what it takes to be a congressman or a senator. Well, we all know that. There's 3 very basic things, but there's so many unwritten qualification rules. I mean, yes, there are 3 written qualifications to be a senator or House of Representative member, but it takes much more than that. Okay, and that's the kind of thing we're going to talk about. What are some of the unwritten things that are embedded within the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branch? When we finish with that, which will take about a month and a half, then we're going to start talking about the third final piece of literature, American scripture, that governs this country, and that's the Bill of Rights. To me, this is the most interesting part of our government because it's the part that is taking place today as we speak. It's the part that we see on a pretty common basis. One of the people there mentioned flag burning. What prompted the law that prevented the American flag to be burnt, and then what prompted the Supreme Court decision to say, no, as long as it's peaceful, you can burn the American flag. That's part of the First Amendment freedom of speech. You may not agree with very much of what's going on. I'm not asking you to agree or disagree. That's something you can do. But what we're going to talk about is how the Bill of Rights really affects us today. So with that being said, I'm going to be done for the day. And again, I encourage you to go out and vote if you haven't done so. And I hope that, everything turns out the way you wanted it to turn out, one way or the other. So we will see you next week, and I will let you go at that. So goodbye, folks. Bye, Donna. Bye, Kent Ridge.
We're under tornado warning.
You are?
We are here.
Uh-oh, that's not good. Get to your shelter, Donna. Okay. We will see you next week.